Okay, on behalf of Foundation for India, Indian Diaspora Studies, I welcome all of you to this very important and timely panel, Indo-US relations under Biden administration. And we are very fortunate today to have three very distinguished speakers. They're experts in the field. We have Professor Walter Andersen. We have Professor Padma Shri Dr. Nanda ji, and we have Captain Alok Bansal, who is joining from India. So today's this panel we are having in two phases. The first one is that each of the speakers will be sharing thoughts for say 10 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion for about 15 minutes, followed by question answer. So first part of the program I will be hosting. I'm Khanderao, Director of FITS. And then second part of the program will be hosted mostly the question by Rakhi Israni, who is our Policy Director. So as we know that we are at the very important time that after 4 years of very President Prince Trump's administration, and particularly very ups and down in the foreign relations. So we have President Biden taken over as a presidency. And there are a lot of questions. The questions could be, is he going to follow the same policies of President Obama when Biden was vice president over there, or what sort of continuity or the policy changes that we'll see from this administration when it comes to Trump's policies. As we know that President Trump had taken a lot of aggressive stance against China, which actually was much more favored for India. A lot of Indo-Americans supported that. He also had published South South Asian policies, which was also a somewhat paradigm shift. He took an aggressive stance on the troops withdrawal. So a lot of things were there which was related to Indo-US relations in a different pace and posturing. But at the same time, if you remember in the Obama administration, there was a wonderful chemistry between Prime Minister Modi and Obama, and Indo-US relation was already moving towards a great and good direction. Now, in the context of post-Trump, what do we see? So that's a big question. And we have experts. Professor Walter Andersen will start with him first. We'll followed by Professor Nanda ji, and then Captain Alok Bansal. So I would like to first welcome Dr. Andersen, as we know that he has been one of the leading experts on South Asia. He has been earlier in the State Department, and then he was he's the distinguished professor from John Hopkins University. He also teaches in China, in Shanghai, one of the universities in Shanghai. And we have seen him in various international panels on Indo-China relations, US-China, Indo-US relations. So I welcome first Professor Walter Andersen.
Thank you. I want to thank the Foundation for organizing this important discussion, and Khanderao for playing a significant element in that. Yes, it's a very interesting discussion. President Biden assumed office at a time when US-Indian relations have been somewhat cordial, and that has been a significant factor for the last 15 years. There are ups and downs in the relationship. You had mentioned one, the withdrawal of US troops, or, you know, as it turns now, it's not likely to be a withdrawal, but the policy on Iran is another area where there have been some differences, and there will be some more. The US has differences with Canada. on several important issues as well. So, but by and large, the tenor of the relationship has been positive. And one can measure that from the time of the 2005 Indo-US Civil Military Agreement. And subsequent to that agreement has been a host of things such as joint military exercises. I read somewhere that the US has more military exercises with India than with any other country in the world. And there are some exercises that in fact are coming up as well. And so it includes joint military exercises. It includes the sale of sophisticated military equipment, substantially increased trade, and high-level visits on both sides. You can go on and on and on. Now, this cordiality is in marked contrast to the first 5 decades of the relationship of the two countries, the first 5 decades after India's independence, when both sides used moral arguments to justify their foreign policy stands. India used non-alignment as its major rhetorical line, and the US used the Cold War. The US often interpreted India's stand as a lack of support for democracy against authoritarian communism. And India often interpreted the US Cold War rhetoric as dangerous to a stable peace, and therefore dangerous to it as a new country. I was a student of Hans Morgenthau at the University of Chicago. In fact, he was one of the readers of my dissertation. And he imbibed in me the view that pragmatic self-interest is the appropriate maxim on which to build foreign policy and to avoid the highly moralistic rhetoric of the Cold War. Unfortunately, there's a strain of that in both countries. And it occasionally comes back to bite us both. And I'll say a few things about that in a minute. Perhaps the most substantial factor motivating the cordiality has been the mutual concern about the rise of China. That's both militarily and before that economically, and its growing assertiveness both at sea and along its land frontiers. This is one area where the new Biden administration and that of the former president, and I'll avoid his name since it tends to arouse so much controversy, and the former president coincide. From the US perspective, India, more than any other Asian country, has the size, wealth, military power to reduce the opportunities for Chinese aggression in Asia. Still another factor shaping this administration's policy toward India is that Democrats have traditionally been more sympathetic toward India than toward, for example, Pakistan or China, where the military plays a major role in government, and I'm talking about Pakistan, or to China with its authoritarian military political system. And the large majority of the some 4 million Indian Americans have traditionally voted for the Democrat Party, including in the last election, and partly because Democrats have generally taken a favorable view toward India in the Asian context, and more willing to accept Indian Americans in their ranks. Hence, an unprecedented number of Indians have been appointed to policy positions. I'm sure you know the names of many of them. Keep in mind that the vice president, who we talked about earlier, is of Indian background, and several senior political appointees are Indian Americans, including 4 of the most senior officials in the Department of Energy, an area where there is considerable interaction between our two countries. However, I want to add a caveat, and that is that the Democrats have also traditionally been more concerned about human rights issues than have Republicans. And it is largely from the ranks of the Democratic Party has come criticism of human rights issues in India, such as the abrogation of Constitutional Article 370 on autonomy for Kashmir, amending citizenship rules that seem to discriminate against Muslims, and more recently, the farmers' agitation in Delhi. These issues are often presented here in the US out of context, and the government needs to exercise care in how, the Indian government, how it presents such issues in this time of the social media and the power of high-tech platforms. All are results of all the Indian steps have been the result of a democratic process, however. On Kashmir, the issue is really an effort of the Modi government, as I interpret it, to reduce religion as a source of identity for Kashmiri Muslims, and is not a policy directed against Kashmiri Muslims. The citizenship law, in my view, however, is the weakest, and is one area where I strongly disagree with the Modi government's policy. on this particular question. That we can talk about that later if you'd like. Shaping the ties to China now is a continuing Chinese assertiveness, just as the Biden administration has assumed office, such as overflights in areas close to Taiwan and over the South China Sea, and of course, Chinese assertiveness in the eastern ranges of Ladakh, and there are reports also some more incursions on the Bhutan-India-China tri-junction. And then, of course, there was the crackdown in Hong Kong against pro-democracy demonstrators and efforts to suppress Muslims in Western China. Such moves by China challenge both American efforts to maintain international primacy and Indian efforts to secure its regional security. Ironically, China seems to believe that Indian commitment to strategic autonomy will block it from moving substantially closer to the US. And so that gives China greater room for maneuver with India. I see this in reading some of the Chinese press and my colleagues at Tongji and other places. They don't think India and the US are serious about moving closer to each other. Well, no one in the US believes that India and the US plan to form a military alliance directed against China. The US seems to have accepted India's tit-for-tat response to Chinese assertiveness, especially that regarding Kashmir, and that's reflected in India building infrastructure along the border to match that of China, and conducting security dialogues with the US, Japan, and Australia regarding the Indo-Pacific region, demonstrating that India has the option of moving incrementally toward these other democracies, especially the US, should China continue to push against India and its interests. What India probably needs is a better effort to explain what it is doing, certainly here in the US. And that generally is that such policies that I've just mentioned are generally, with a few exceptions, in the security interest of both sides. There will be some areas of disagreement, there always are, such as Iran, but those can be managed. As I mentioned at the beginning, the US has problems with Canada, for example, on a range of issues. And we will as well with India, and that's to be expected. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Walter Andersen. Now, I would like to welcome Professor Nanda. As I briefly introduced earlier, Professor Nanda is one of the most renowned scholar in the international law. He is awardee of India's third highest civil Padma Award, his Padma Shri. He has been provost of International Law School at Denver for almost 15 years. In his honor, there is a chair at Denver University, and he is a recipient of various international law awards, as well as he has been teaching all over the world. He has authored more than 30 books, and he's one of the most known personality in Indo-American community. So I welcome Professor Nanda.
Well, thank you very much, Khanderao-ji, for this very generous introduction. I am delighted and honored to be with you, and I want to thank the Foundation for initiating this wonderful and very, very timely session. Professor Andersen has given eloquently the past background and history, so I won't go into it. But I will start by saying how before the elections, at least in India, there was nostalgia for 4 years that Trump had. And they had felt that Trump was very close to India. In Ahmedabad, for example, I remember when he spoke and he said, America loves India. America respects India. And America will always be faithful and loyal friends with India. So I think the thought simply was that if Trump's 4 more years continue, then probably these relationships would further be strengthened. But I think there were some who at that time had felt very strongly that perhaps 4 more years would not be good for India. And I remember Shyam Saran, who at one time was Foreign Secretary and now Senior Fellow at Center for Policy Research. And what he said was, why would another Trump team not have been good? And his answer is, because the Indo-US partnership has become so important to India that it needs a US which is not deeply polarized, dysfunctional, and losing the economic competition with China. I think I'll probably leave it there, but I would suggest to you that as Professor Andersen and all those who follow geopolitical setting know, that countries' relationships, they depend primarily upon their own substantive interests. True that values count, and India as a democracy, US as a democracy, and their values in terms of human rights and rule of law, all that is there, democracy. But the point simply is that now the interests also, to a great extent, have been aligned. Simply to remind you that the upward trajectory began with Bill Clinton and continued. And as Professor Andersen has said, that India and the United States have been partners and at times being considered as strategic partners. Trump had, before the sunset came, before he lost the election, many of you might have seen Indo-Pacific strategic document. And in that one, there was a key role for India in the region. And the question simply is, what kind of relationship under Biden will continue? And here I would simply suggest to you that the relationship under Biden will continue as before. Biden has been to India. Biden has spoken well of India. I was looking at Biden's statements. One, that he had Joe Biden's agenda for the Indian American community. Then his statements on India. I won't go into them, but those statements do indicate that at least in rhetoric at the present time, Biden is not changing the policy in looking at India as a strategic partner. And India, because of what happened with China, and especially on these border issues, India finally has recognized that it has got to have a pivot toward the United States. And it's not going to enter into an alliance, but there is kind of a soft alliance. And at the present time, if I look at Biden, if I look at Kamala Harris, and if I look also, because Biden has at the present time a veteran Asia hand, Kurt Campbell. He has newly created a position. It's on Indo-Pacific Coordinator on the National Security Council. And I went back and looked at what Kurt Campbell had done and said, and I feel very, very good about the possibility that in the future, those relations will continue. 2+2, Quad, all these things that had begun. Professor Andersen talked about military relationships, and along with the defense, at least on China, countering China, the United States feels very strongly that India is going to play an important role. But let me mention to you 4 issues that will be the key. One is China-Pakistan and how the United States feels about China. Is the US going to have a nuanced policy about China? The other day when President Biden spoke on foreign policy, and his first foreign policy statement, where he went to the State Department. As you probably recall, 4 years ago, Trump had gone to CIA. And this was again symbolic, but a very clear indication when he says,
America is back. America is going to work with alliances. America is the one where it says diplomacy is back. And under all those kind of settings, you can probably see that although there might be nuanced about China, but his statement on China, and I read it very carefully, and it's not going to make any big change on China because for India, that China issue becomes an important one. I won't go too much into it on Pakistan. The new defense secretary has said that he's going to work closely with them. But I think the point here we do need to keep in mind is that there is an issue, an important issue, and that is of Afghanistan, that at the present time is Taliban, how to get Pakistan to assist in order to see that the Taliban stops doing what they are doing. Violence is on the increase. And Taliban, Afghanistan negotiations are going nowhere. There has been an impasse. So I think we need to keep that in mind. I need to move on quickly. On trade, Trump had done one thing. He had said no longer the benefits to India because it's no longer going to be considered a developing country. And under, as you know, WTO and the trade rules, India does not get that status anymore. Third issue that's going to come, and many people talk about it, is the kind of internal domestic policies of India. It will be Kashmir, it will be CAA, it will be at the present time what's happening with the farmers. And on domestic policy, Trump did not say anything. What about Biden? What about Harris? And my thought here is, and I hope that I'm right about it, that although Biden is not going to be totally unconcerned about what's happening, what's happened in Burma, he has spoken very strongly about it. But I don't think that there will be any vocal, there will be any public kind of tiff on it. They'll probably talk with each other in diplomatic terms. So I think the fourth one, and I think I'll leave that out because there are all these international challenges, whether it's Iran, whether it's climate, whether it's many other issues that are going to be there. So let me conclude. My conclusion would be that India, US, they'll both be pragmatic. My thought simply is that on values, nobody had any issue. But on their vision, about their interests, on their, at the present time, practical, concrete steps in order to do that, my own feeling is that that will stay in sync, that it's an expanding strategic partnership. It will continue, that soft alliance going to be there. Obviously, Biden is going to be initially consumed with corona issues, with jobs, with economy. And in that one, probably at times, the issue will come up that Biden would like to see jobs here. But at the same time, Trump had not been very helpful on visas, on all these immigration issues with India. So the future under Biden is bright. India-US relations are on this upward trajectory. That trajectory is not going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandaji. You covered very well four different dimensions of Indo-US relations, which are important to both the countries, starting from basically China, trade, Afghanistan, and India's domestic issues. And thanks for kind of giving positive hope in the way that the Indo-US relation will unfold further. I would like to welcome Captain Alok Bansal, and he's one of the experts in South Asia's and particularly related to Indo-Pakistan, Afghanistan. He has written books on the issue. He is also directly engaged into level 2, level 3 discussions. He himself is from Navy background. He almost spent more than 2 decades, and then he had joined India's leading defense think tank, IDSA, and he is now executive director of India Foundation. I would like to welcome Captain Alok Bansal.
Thank you, Khande Raoji. I think one of the problems of being the last speaker is that everything that you wish to say has already been said. So there may be some repetition. India-US relationship under Biden administration. Firstly, let me emphasize that I have always believed that India-US relationship is driven by common values, and that these common values of democracy and pluralism have ensured that even during the Cold War era, when we were arrayed against each other, perceptibly arrayed against each other, there was a huge amount of interaction between India and US as far as citizens were concerned, as far as people-to-people contact was there, as far as IMF loans were concerned, the grants were concerned, that continued. And I think that common values will ensure that there is a bipartisan consensus within US that irrespective of which administration comes, there is not likely to be any drastic change of policies. This has further been cemented by the fact that India-US now share a very robust defense relationship. And why defense relationship is important, of course, to the US audience, I need not emphasize. But in US, when an administration changes, virtually the entire administration changes, most of the senior officials in the State Department change. But in the Department of Defense, it is the military hierarchy which remains static. And as a result, the defense relationship which is forged remains, has a greater inertia than the foreign policy relationship, which is often shaped at the State Department. That is one important. The second important facet which we need to understand is that the strongest glue that binds today India and US after the common values is the diaspora. As the Indian diaspora has risen in stature, its numbers, its qualitative reach, so has the Indo-US relations. And I think the Biden administration has a huge Indian presence that itself shows how Indian diaspora has come of age. The very fact that Vice President Kamala Harris is there shows. And I think, as earlier speakers said, the Indian diaspora has traditionally overwhelmingly voted in favor of Democrats. So that's one advantage that you'll have. The Democrats have, by and large, always tended to take Indian diaspora into cognizance while framing their policies. Unfortunately, in India, most people look at Indo-US relationship as a subset of two triangular relationship. When you talk of India-US, people will say India-US-Pakistan or India-US-China. And now these are the two triangular relationship as a subset of which India-US relationship is seen. Now, since President Trump was rhetorical as far as his opposition to China was concerned, that sort of rhetoric may not be seen when you have the new administration, President Biden, because it's a different personality. He's not one of those who would get up from the bed and send a tweet against China or Pakistan. So that sort of thing may not be there. But I think considering the geopolitical interests of the two countries, we would see enormous congruence. And I think this congruence is visualized even within China as well as within the United States, though a lot of Chinese believe that India's assertion of autonomy will ensure that India does not become an ally. Yes, I have no doubts that India would never be a Japan or an Australia. But India and US as two pluralistic democracies have a huge convergence of interest that draws them together and that pits them against China. And that sort of, that policy line which was taken by last few administrations will continue. Though President Biden has said that he wants to improve relations, he wants to negotiate with China, but as I said, in a strategic or in a defense posture, security posture, the freedom of navigation in South China Sea will continue to be a cherished principle as far as US security policies are concerned, as far as US defense policies are concerned. Indo-Pacific is going to be an arena where India and US will continue to exercise jointly. As Professor Walter said, that US does not exercise with any other country more than what it exercises probably today with India. We have huge number of exercises that we do jointly. Now, coming to India, Pakistan, US, now that's a more important issue because most Indians look at US policies towards India from the prism of this triangular relationship. Now, to my mind, as statements that have emerged from DC saying that they would renegotiate Taliban deal and they are going to look back into it is a very, very positive development. President Trump, in his overwhelming hurry to get out of Afghanistan, was very keen to negotiate with Taliban, and that his extraordinary keenness to negotiate with Taliban had given enormous leverage to Pakistan. In fact, we saw in between that Pakistan, from being a pariah, had come center stage because when they wanted to negotiate with Taliban, they knew that Pakistan held the cards. And in fact, the key negotiators of Taliban were nothing but those who were in the custody of Pakistan for a long time. Now, if President Biden goes by the advice that is given by CENTCOM or the other military commanders, I think we will see a far more nuanced approach to Taliban. I think US would not like to surrender all that it had stood for so many years by just negotiating with Taliban and walking off and leaving the Afghan administration in jeopardy. And that is, I think, very, very important. And I think we will see improvement. Another area where I think India stands to gain is, I think, President Biden's looking at Middle East. I think there is going to be some amount of change. This is one area where I think there will be a significant change from what was President Trump's policies. And I think not only we will see some change as far as US policies towards Saudi Arabia is concerned, but what more significantly, we should see some change towards Iran. Though, of course, President Biden has recently said that we are not going to lift up sanctions immediately for Iran to adhere to the agreement. But I think since President Obama at the end of his presidency had claimed that the biggest achievement of his presidency was the Iran nuclear deal, I think we, with the help of the Europeans, we could see that deal re-emerging. And from India's point of view, that deal is very, very important because Iran gives India not only an access to Afghanistan and Central Asia, but there is a huge congruence of interest as far as India and Iran is concerned. So that is there. Coming more specific to the Indo-US relations, I think today Indian population is most concerned about the US visas and H-1B visas, which President Trump had stopped. I think that is going to see an important thing. I think Indian IT firms are going to be extremely happy. And as you know, President Biden has a history of having been pro-India. In fact, this we need to understand that in 2001, as Senate Foreign Policy Committee, he had actually helped lift sanctions against India. Whenever he has been in Foreign Policy Committee, he has always advised US-India close relations. And of course, he played a pivotal role as far as US-India nuclear deal was concerned. So we have seen President Biden has been pro-India, that there is no doubt about it. H-1B visas, we are going to see a positive upturn. As far as immigration is concerned, professional students continuing to work after their education. Also, he has given statements that he would welcome that, which to my mind is a very, very positive statement for India is concerned. On trade, as we know, President Trump had lifted GSP. I think we would want the GSP to be restored. And I think on trade front, we will stand to benefit from whatever policies I think the government takes. On the flip side, we need to understand that both the countries still have certain moralistic rhetoric which continues. As Walter had said initially, there is certain amount of idealism, there is still some amount of moralistic rhetoric that will continue. And there's going to be some pressure from the various factions of the Democratic Party on issues concerning human rights, specifically with respect to Jammu and Kashmir. But government of India has already started moving in that direction. As you know, just day before they restored 4G internet in Jammu and Kashmir after a very, very long period of time. So things are normalizing and Jammu and Kashmir has more or less returned to normalcy. So there would be no cause. That's what I presume. Well, of course, as far as CAA is concerned, it has become infructuous because it was a time-bound legislation. As you know, it dealt with a certain period. So its efficacy also would become, to that extent, not very, very significant. So by and large, there are going to be certain differences, but by and large, I see India-US relations coming closer under Biden presidency, and especially in the fields of trade, as far as immigration and people-to-people contact are concerned, we will see greater congruence, greater convergence between India and United States. And with that, I think I'll end my talk. I finished my 10 minutes because I was told 10 minutes, and thereafter we'll take on for Q&A or whatever panel discussions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Captain Alok Bansal. You wonderfully covered different triangular relations or complexities in Indo-US relations. And also you echoed the same positive sentiments that Professor Nanda ji has expressed from this Biden administration. As you called, India is not new to Biden, and Biden is not new to India. There has been some working relations in the decades, and that definitely is going to be helpful in taking these relations further. I would like to take this panel on 4 important issues Professor Vednanda ji has called. I think Walter Andersen also had touched, but I will go into some nuances in our panel discussion, and then we'll let all the participant to ask the questions. Rakhi Israni, who is co-host, she will be actually taking conducting question answer session, and she will share the instructions how to conduct that, but you can post your question in the chat room. I will start with on the China side, or particularly in President Trump had done one remarkable difference when it comes to the foreign policy in post-Cold War, or even during that US was and is a global leader, and President Trump was in a way having various foreign policies and the trade relations which were in the withdrawal or the reversal. And to give an example of TPP, Trans-Pacific treaty, if you look at it, it was a work of 16 countries, started almost 2006, and it was signed just before President Trump took over, and it was going to be ratified. And that treaty was to, it was not just the trade treaty, but it was definitely going to have a huge impact in the Indo-Pacific region and in general, and particularly in the South China Sea. But US didn't sign it, and the rest of the countries did continue further. In the absence of that, it actually opened door to China. China had a counter treaty, and then many countries joined that. South China Sea is very important area, more than 5 trillion trade per year transit through that. World's largest area is the Indo-Pacific region. And Trump did acknowledge that aspect, and then gave a thrust to the Quad. So wanted to have your thoughts about the TPP and the future of the Quad in Biden administration, particularly the impact in Indo-Pacific and South China Sea. We can go with Walter Andersen. He has been actively visiting China. Then we can hear from Professor Nanda and Alok ji.
Well, regarding the TPP, of course, China is not a member of it either. And if you recall, Hillary Clinton also rejected it as well. Because, you know, the problem with many of these international treaties, and here I think Trump was right, it affected employment in the US. Many jobs left the US. And you get to a bigger issue. I was going to talk about that regarding Afghanistan and the withdrawal. Now, I think it's, in terms of strategy, it's not a wise issue. It's not a wise policy that the Trump administration projected of withdrawing, because we maybe then go back to the issue where we have to fight terrorism again, all over again. But you have to keep in mind, this war is not popular in the US. And the more that young Americans die in it, the more unpopular it will become. Recall who fights. It's not my neighbors who live here in a middle-class area of Washington, D.C. It's the poor. It's the sons and daughters of the poor who fight. And it's among them, if the Democrats want to get the working class vote again, it's got to appeal to that group. That group is not enthusiastic about US involvement in overseas wars. They just aren't. And I think we have to keep that into consideration, because this could turn around and bite the Democrats if they continue to push on this issue. And here's a case where India, of course, would like the US to stay, because they fully see the problem of a return of terrorism in Afghanistan has happened before. But there's a domestic issue here as well. And one always has to keep that in mind. There's a domestic quality to this as well as an international one. On the South China Sea and other areas, this administration is more alliance oriented, and I think that's to the strength, that's to the advantage of Indo-US relations. And I think you're going to see a greater reliance of working with allies. I also think that China is going to continue to push so that allies will have to work together. In the face of that, they'll have an incentive of doing so. Now, as I mentioned, and you might read, Ashley Tellis has written about this as well. The Chinese are not all don't think that India and US are serious. They think that India's commitment to strategic autonomy is such that India will keep a distance. I'd like to hear what Alok Bansal has to say about this. Will keep a distance from really doing anything. And a question I would ask is, if China really pushed, what does India want the US to do? And will the US do it? A lot of writings have come out in the US recently that many in the US and in India expect too much of this improved relationship. It's not going to work out. Will it work out in this key area if China pushes against India in a big way? Will the US come to the aid? I'm curious, what do India want the US to do in that situation? And what do you think the US would do? That's it.
On China, I'll take a broader look at it. Notwithstanding Biden's nuanced policy, China as an adversary, Xi's policy for hegemonic outreach all over Asia, South China Sea, intellectual property, there is absolutely no way that Biden and Biden administration can get closer to China. Nuanced policy, yes, but the basic issue is going to remain. Will they work together? Well, they have to. Climate is a good issue. So I think Biden and the Biden team is smart enough, because if you look at his foreign policy statement on Putin and Russia, he's going to work with Russia on New START. He's going to work on Russia on many issues, but at the same time, he doesn't miss talking about Navalny. He doesn't miss talking about cybersecurity. He doesn't miss talking about elections. So the same thing is going to be true with China. With Xi, and Xi's at the present time looking forward 20 years on, and Chinese saying in a way to the US, look, the time has come. After the Second World War, UK give you the metal. Time has come, you give us now the metal. We are the ones who are going to run the world. And so China-US relations, they'll always be adversarial. The point simply is that hope they don't need to go to war, and Biden administration understands it. Very briefly on trade, I think the point simply is that Biden administration is not going to do simply transactional relationships and negotiations. And on that one, I need to say to you that pivot toward Asia, pivot toward India that had begun earlier, I think that's going to continue. India is not a part of that trade deal. And the reason is simple. India does not want those Chinese goods simply to inundate India. And India does not want dumped by all those Chinese goods. I just wrote my column, last column on Afghanistan and Taliban. I wouldn't go into it, but we cannot at the present time simply leave Afghanistan to Taliban
and to Pakistan and Taliban to take over, and what's going to happen to women, what's going to happen to all that has happened earlier. Not that US is going to stay in Afghanistan, but US must not abandon Afghanistan. That hastily entered into that agreement by Trump at the present time, Biden has given a very clear indication that the troops are not going to be all withdrawn, that Taliban has got to show that it's complying with the accord that it reached with Bush, not with Bush, with Trump. And so I think that is at the present time still an issue that is going to be sorted out. But again, it's going to be nuanced, and the US cannot and will not simply leave Afghanistan and abandon it as it has done many times before.
Thank you, Nandaji. Alok ji, want to comment further? You're mute. You need to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, just 2-3 small points. I thought Walter talked about Afghanistan, where he brought out the internal US dynamics, and any president has to cater to internal dimensions because nobody wants the US troops to be deployed. There is generally an aversion to overseas deployment of US troops. Let me clarify, I, for one, do not recommend that US should remain involved in active combat in Afghanistan. What US needs to keep in Afghanistan is a token presence, because if you go back into the history of Afghanistan, you'll see the governments in Afghanistan have not toppled because somebody has militarily won. It is because the people have crossed over, and people cross over because Afghans have traditionally been fickle-minded. If there is a perception that this government is going, they will cross over. Now the token presence enables, provides that permanence to Afghan government. If there is a token presence, I'm not trying to say that you can remain in a fortified thing, just maintain one airbase, single with minimal presence, that's good enough. You don't have to engage yourself in any combat. The sheer presence provides that sort of permanence to the government. And that is, I think, important, because if you look back into history of Afghanistan, that perception that this government is staying is important, at least for next 10 years, till this Taliban negotiations and all that gets over. That's important. As far as strategic autonomy, that was a question which he asked. There is no doubt that Indians cherish their strategic autonomy. And to that extent, India would definitely not like to castigate Bashar al-Assad or Iranian regime just because there's a change in government in United States and there's a change in policies. That would not happen. So that sort of strategic autonomy, I think New Delhi would always like to retain. But as I said, there is a general congruence of interest when we look at international community and congruence of values, which brings the two countries together. So you would not see major dichotomy. As far as India-China issue is concerned, that's a very interesting question what Walter asked. What does India expect? And that's where there is a problem. I think by and large, a general public in India has huge expectations from United States when it comes to India-China confrontation or deviation. I think we need to understand that India today is competent militarily to hold on to China. That's not an issue. I hope there is no war. We don't want. It is in the economic arena, it's in the diplomatic arena that where India really requires the US support and a firm support. And that's where I think the Trump administration was useful. Its policies against Chinese companies, which he had initiated, were widely welcomed because that led to certain shifting of capital from China to other countries. And that was, I think, in the interest, because eventually India needs to catch up. We need to economically rise in a position where we are in a position to take China. And this, one more issue where I think India needs strong support from the United States is in its opposition to Belt and Road Initiative, because Belt and Road Initiative, one of the prongs of that Belt and Road Initiative passes through our sovereign territory, and that we have been actually opposing it. And I think that fact needs to be highlighted. And I think India is been always opposed to that particular thing. And I think it's as far as BRI and its tentacles, it's the Chinese tentacles which are spreading and spreading very fast into Europe, which you could see by the last deal that's been signed between US and China. I think that is where we would expect diplomatic and economic support from the United States.
Khandarajji, I want to just have a footnote.
Yeah,
And that footnote is two footnotes. One is that the United States has been firmly opposed to Belt and Road. And so India and the US interests on that count are similar. And second, I want to underscore that values alone don't cut relationships between countries. US and India relationship, even those days when US and India did not see eye to eye, values were there to support each other. But they alone don't cut it. You have to have interests. And today those interests also are being aligned along with the values. And that is where I feel that India-US relations and that trajectory is going to continue.
Could I add another footnote to what was just said? Japan and India have been cooperating on something which one could roughly say is similar to Belt and Road. We haven't talked about Japan at all, or virtually at all, in this discussion, and it is an important consideration as India considers, and I like the point that was just made, of taking a stance that in effect asserts its own interests. Belt and Road clearly, I've been going to China every year. The Belt and Road is pushed. Foreign delegations are being brought in, to tell you the virtues of Belt and Road. Belt and Road has some enormous problems connected to it. It's in effect, many of these countries are hawking themselves to huge debts that they're being built up by loans from China, and they're beginning to feel it. The Indians and the Japanese have taken a much more, nuanced approach to assistance, and one in which they use local labor, local expertise. The Chinese in Belt and Road use Chinese expertise. Several of my colleagues in China are right now serving at the embassies of their countries because they understand something about that country, because China takes such a close look and involvement in Belt and Road. The Indians don't nearly do as much, and I think that's to the benefit of India.
So thanks, since all the three of you timely shared your footnotes, I would like to welcome our policy director, Rakhi Israni, to take over and conduct the question answers, and then she will conclude. So Rakhi Israni, please take over.
Thank you so much, Khandarajji. Thank you to the speakers who were wonderful talks, very informative. We've already have a couple of questions. One question that's come up a couple of times has been that if you look at Obama's time, some of the speeches and all, especially the ones he made in India, were a bit condescending to India. It's been stated by a number of people that if Clinton had won instead of Trump, then the reforms in India that Modi had undertaken would have been a lot harder. And now with Biden, it's not Biden per se, but the concern really is the Democratic Party and the growing influence of the progressive left in that party that is less focused on economic interest and common sense strategic relationships and more focused on perceived human rights. Do you think that what's happening domestically in terms of the growth of the progressive left in the Democratic Party will influence Biden away from common sense strategic relations between India and US?
Can I start there? Having been in the State Department for almost 30 years, I can tell you bureaucracies count. And you talked about, people at the top, what their views are. Let's not neglect the people further down have an enormous impact. Anyone who's worked in any bureaucracy knows that. Bureaucracies can stifle, what the senior people want to do. And they do it all the time, as you probably know, if you ever had to deal with bureaucracy. My wife has to deal with the Indian bureaucracy all the time. And she can tell you how important and influential bureaucracies can be on basic policy questions. yes, the left in the Democratic Party is increasingly outspoken and is an issue. Now Biden, Blinken, and a few, and the new Secretary of Defense may not be overly moved by it, but people down the line might be. And so India has to be doubly careful in how it presents these issues. So far, it has not, in my view, done a particularly good job in presenting itself. Its public diplomacy has not been great. It needs a better job at public diplomacy to explain what it's doing. And I think it has some very valid explanations for most of the issues that we earlier talked about that could be controversial, with one exception, and that's the citizenship. But as someone mentioned, that it kind of was time bound and may sink away, and I certainly hope it does. But you know, it has to do a better job. The External Affairs Minister, when he came to the US, what, a year or so ago, had to explain Kashmir, obviously. And I thought he did a good job. You know, it's not that the government is anti-Muslim, but it is opposed to identity in Kashmir being defined on a religious basis. You know, and that's perfectly valid. We would be too in the United States if you had an identity issue like that define who you were. But they do need to do a better job. It can't just be the External Affairs Minister. It has to be other parts of the Indian bureaucracy that get involved in that as well.
I need to make two quick points. One is that having had many of my students in foreign service and playing pretty important roles around the world, I think they play a very important role. I know that people usually talk about Blinken and obviously the Secretary of State, and recently when he said, India is bipartisan success story, he made it clear that strategic ties with India will remain strong. But now coming to bureaucracy, I think that also plays a very important role. There is absolutely no doubt about it. So long as India's diplomacy is concerned, at the present time, there is a very savvy, very astute, very seasoned foreign minister of India. And having known what he's doing and having known, at least to some extent, by looking at how he has reached out, not simply to the US, but to other countries, I feel very good about India's foreign policy at the present time, and diplomatically and tactically and both strategically to move in this direction. So I feel at the present time, don't want to be complacent about it, but I feel comfortable. I think India, unfortunately, is not able to have its own narrative internationally understood, recognized, acknowledged. And I think it's right that India needs to do a better job on it. But at the present time, the embassies, consulates, the foreign minister, they are trying very hard. And the past is not a very good precedent for the current thing, because for many, many years, Indian bureaucracy has been dormant, has not taken initiatives that are needed in the for India's future, for India's own benefits. And I think that today there is a change, and I feel good about the change.
Can I add a footnote there? Probably all of you remember about 20 years ago, India hired its first lobbyist in the US. There was enormous resistance to that. I was in the State Department. We couldn't believe that the Indian government and its leading intellectuals were against hiring a lobbyist. And because the feeling was that the bureaucracy could do it. Well, the bureaucracy couldn't do it. And they finally did, but there's still resistance. I still see in the press in India articles written about, that our own government can do it. We don't need to do things like hire lobbyists to do it. Well, that's wrong. India needs to do so. And the very fact that's an issue tells you the extent to which there's a mistrust of using public relations to advance the cause. I think that's a big problem.
Bureaucracy is the bane of Indian government, and I think that fact we need to understand. I think this government is trying to reform the bureaucracy. It's not yet started, but still a long way to go. As far as the policies of this government are concerned, I think most of the policies can be defined and are well-meaning, except for what Walter said. And that issue is, I think, more or less dead and buried. So I think hopefully that will not be a big issue. On Jammu and Kashmir, as I said, we are on a firm footing. Things are normalized. Things are working well. But as somebody asked this question, yes, there will be pressure from ultra-left. And I think certain statements would keep coming. But one odd statement should not derail the relationship, or we should not be concerned about that. I think in diplomacy, you need to overlook certain statements coming from certain quarters, and that is an essential requirement.
Can I add a footnote there? You're right that the external affairs minister is brilliant. I know him personally. He made a blunder of the first order, however, when he refused to see a U.S. congressional delegation.
I agree.
Congresswoman Jayapal. Is that her name? I keep forgetting what her name is. But he refused. Yeah, because she made some critical comments about Kashmir. This was an opportunity missed. He could have sat, because he's brilliant. He could have sat down with that group and, and explained what the Indian position was, which in my view is perfectly rational. But he didn't, and that aroused enormous press coverage. It was a blunder of the first order. Now, many people in India praised him. That, I think, was foolish itself, because it was not a wise choice.
Faux pas happen. And
that's more than a faux pas.
They can happen. And that I think you and I have done that also in life.
Yeah,
and I think you're right in saying it, that I think best, it would have been much better that they had spoken, there would have been a dialogue, there would have been an exchange. And I think he probably learned from that. But that alone does not cast doubt on his capacity to be able to do things. You know him, I also know him.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Shivangi, you had a question.
Yes.
If you
okay. No, it's a very interesting aspect on India-Iran relations. Recently, just last week, Iran went into Pakistan territory, and just like India did a few months ago, they went and captured their soldiers which were imprisoned by Pakistan. I know we have good relations with Iran. Is it possible to have alliance with India and Iran together to work with the Pakistan and put them in a place where they belong to? It's for anyone who is interested to answer this question. I think it is a good time to have some kind of understanding with Iran and India in the Southeast Asian foreign policy.
I'll just try and answer this, having been to Iran a number of times. I think not many others would have been to Iran in the last few years. See, there is some amount of congruence of interest, and we need to understand. When Taliban was ruling Afghanistan, India, Iran had a congruence of interest. We had a very frequent Northern Alliance was being supported by us. And we have a huge interest in Iran because Iranian crude suits Indian refineries the most. Iran provides to India the only access, land-based access to Afghanistan and Central Asia, because all other accesses either go via Pakistan and China. And when Iran gets sanctioned by the United States, India's linkages with this particular whole area gets snapped, and our access to this area reduces considerably. The problem with Iran is that the theological regime which is there is too closely aligned with Shia Islam. And that also brings us together, because in Pakistan, there has been a persecution of Shias. That also brings us together. In fact, but very often, being a theological regime, it takes certain stances. It comes out with statements on certain issues, which are difficult to accept. And the second point is, in last few years, India has built very good relations with both Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as well as United Arab Emirates. The third problem today is that the Israel today believes that Sunni Islam is passé. They feel that Al-Qaeda and Islamic State can be easily managed. As far as Israel is concerned, today the only terrorist threat emanates from Shia Islam, and that is led by Iran. So good relations with Iran put you also in a little bit of a problem with Israel. So that's the problem. India has very good relations with Iran traditionally, but under Trump administration, it came under strain. The Chabahar port, which India operates, we have not been able to provide whatever we had committed to. Even the cranes have only come after Biden administration has taken place. We were not in a position to position cranes because no ship was willing to take it there because the companies would come under sanctions and things like that. So those issues have been there traditionally. We have now managed to do something. It is in India's interest to remain engaged with Iran. Iran is a very, very important country, civilizationally, economically, trade-wise, and as well as geopolitically, as far as India is concerned.
What is the reaction about Iranians going into Pakistan? I mean,
Iranians had done it earlier also. They had actually fired across the international border. And the second thing we need to understand, unlike India-Pakistan border, Iran-Pakistan border is not manned. So it's an open border. So if you actually plan it and if you have a good intelligence, it's feasible. But now with Pakistan, all its three de jure neighbors have had conflicts across the borders. That is India, Iran, and Afghanistan. Of course, there is one de facto neighbor, that is China, which is okay with them. But all three de facto neighbors of Pakistan have had cross-border firings, infiltrations, and military actions. So to that extent, yes, we have, and in fact, Iran and other countries have taken hint from what India did, and they have been indulging in that. The fact is that this fact has not been highlighted, it has been completely blanked in Pakistani media, shows how seriously Pakistan has been affected by it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I don't know if there's any other comments on that question. Otherwise, there's a couple of other questions that are in the chat.
I think Damleji has raised his hand.
Okay, Damleji, if you would like to ask your question. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear? Yeah. My question that yesterday Pakistan offered the referendum in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So how much that will affect to the India-US relationship when Pakistan say, oh, we are ready for referendum in Pakistan occupied Kashmir? Will that pressure, US government, Biden government, especially progressive leftists from Democratic Party, pressurize Indian government for that?
Could I respond to that? Could I respond to that?
Sure.
Yeah, you will have people on the left, and I'm glad my colleague, Mr. Dalma, asked a very interesting question. You will have people on the left take up, and say, yes, it should. I think what you're saying is it should apply to all of Kashmir. You should have a referendum, all of it. I can tell you that the professionals will not. And on this sort of issue, it's the professionals who will shape the policy. That it doesn't make sense from the beginning because they know, one, Pakistan's not sincere. It would not have a sincere referendum on even its part, because for fear that if they did, they'd lose, to be quite frank. There's a lot of unhappiness among many of the people who live in the Pakistan part, occupied part of Kashmir. And then the Kashmir issue is too complicated to introduce something like that at the present time. So do I think it will happen or have much effect? You'll have some statements, particularly on the left, who are supporting it, but among the professionals, I think it would be rejected. It doesn't make sense.
I simply want to say to Damleji, the answer is no. The Biden administration will not take a stand on it. The issue of referendums that began as an international lawyer have looked at Kashmir and Kashmir issue in depth. Those days are gone. There is a change, and that is a drastic change in the situation, circumstances. And I think once you have that kind of change under international law, even those prior statements do not hold ground. So the answer is no.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions before we conclude. Rajinderji asked a question earlier that being a neighboring country, Myanmar, what's happening in Myanmar, how will that affect the US-India relations, especially considering China's role in the region?
I'll simply say it's a pretty delicate issue. And for India, it is much more delicate than for many other countries because of its cultural relations with Burma, because of China's inroads into Burma, and because of the sanctions against Burma and around the international community. And yesterday, 100,000 people in Yangon doing all that. So I think at this stage, we'll probably spend the whole session, another hour, talking about different issues. But I think it's simply a delicate part for India.
Can I add to that? Also, from my experience, I taught at Yangon University for several months as well. And I happen to know from that experience that there was considerable opposition to the military at the time I was there 4 years ago. And I know from context now in Yangon that there is enormous amount of opposition. That issue has to work its way out. But India has to be careful for the reasons that my colleague just mentioned now, because otherwise you give China an opening, to exploit the situation. If everyone rejects the Burmese, I think we have to talk to them. India's got to talk to them as well to try to work out. But here's the issue here again, where you're going to have ideological issues will arise, particularly on the left. That say, oh, we must discard. We cannot. The bigger issue for the US in Asia is China, and we should not forget that.
I would just like to add a few things. I have been to Burma, I think, every year for last 5 or 6 years. Every year I have visited Burma. I think we need to understand that what India has learned in past few years after 1999 was that despite overwhelming support for democracy and NLD, Tatmadaw is not going to be dislodged easily. That please understand, unless of course there is an international pressure. Even last time it did it. And when we actually disengaged with the military government, China had an open field. And I think that we would not like, because Myanmar is extremely important for India, firstly for its Act East policy, because we are hemmed in from the west and north. So the only access India has to a greater market as well as for resources is through the East. And Act East policy, the Burma is the gateway for Southeast Asia and other places. And also Burmese cooperation is extremely important for curbing some of the minor insurgencies that occur in Northeast India, because these insurgents actually crisscross. So we would engage. So India has come out with a pro forma statement that is required. That we want democracy to be restored. We would try and nudge the military leadership on the path of democracy, but we will continue to engage with I think the government in Myanmar. And I don't think so there is going to be any divergence on that, because even I think the United States would want India to remain engaged with Myanmar so that Myanmar doesn't go totally into the lap of Beijing. I think for that purpose, I think India is a strong antidote or a strong contender which should remain engaged with Myanmar so that Chinese influence does not increase. We also need to understand that one of the reasons why military staged a coup was that recent dalliance between NLD and Beijing. In fact, the in recent past, NLD government had been going very close to Beijing, which did create certain problems in Naypyidaw as far as the military establishment was concerned.
Can I add a footnote to that? It was my experience that the military who were involved in our program were not all that pro-Chinese. In fact, some of the strongest statements about—
They were very anti-Chinese.
Yeah, what came from the military, who are concerned. They in some ways look at their area very pragmatically, and they see the danger of excessive Chinese influence. And don't forget, there's a strong Chinese minority in Myanmar. Most of them, in fact, are Muslim, interestingly enough. But there have been every once in a while riots which one will hear as anti-Muslim. Not true. In fact, they tend to be, quote unquote, anti-Chinese riots. And so there is that sense that, you have a Chinese diaspora large in Myanmar, which they're not comfortable with. The military particularly are not comfortable with. And one can, as somebody said, we could go on for hours on what is a fascinating topic. But I tend to agree with Alok that the US is also, I think, planning to take a more nuanced view. You're going to hear a lot of people on the far left for ideological and moralistic grounds say things, but I think at the top, people are going to sort of abide by what is pragmatic and in the US self-interest.
Chinese inroad, in fact, in Burma, and Chinese efforts in many instances on trade. issues have been rejected by the Burmese government. But at the same time, I think what my colleagues have said is going to continue. India is going to keep engaged with the military, maybe nudging them a little bit, and so is the United States. So I think US probably would take sanctions. Sanctions don't matter very much, but at the same time, I think at the present time, the present policy is not going to be changed very much.
Thank you. We have one last question. Actually, this
I
is
think we should probably stop after that question,
yeah,
please.
this is the last question.
I've got to
And
go.
this is about the Farmers' Bill protests. There's been, resolutions and proclamations being passed against not only CA, but now against the Farmers' Bill protests by a couple of US cities. How seriously should those be taken? What reaction is the right reaction from the Indian community? And finally, how can the US, or how can we, what can the US agencies do to help in this regard?
I'll simply give an answer. These cities and these states, whatever they do, it is because of the pressure from people, and I don't think they mean a whole lot in terms of the US policy or in terms of India's policy. I think here the diaspora has got to take action, and I think diaspora has not been able to have its own narrative that is appropriate and that does bring to the attention of the people, educating them, telling them the facts. And I think that part has not been there, that has been lacking, talking with, convincing the media, opinion makers, that has not been there. So I think it's the fault of the Indian diaspora to a great extent, but I don't think that it has got any bearing on US policy toward India or India's policy toward the US.
Could I add something to that? Most academic economists I know of, including those at Johns Hopkins University, think that what the Indian agricultural policy was very prudent. It was long overdue. There's an article 2 days ago in the Wall Street Journal that actually goes into that issue. To some extent, this is a caste issue, Jats, to put it frankly, according to that article. And from what I'm hearing from India, there's some validity to that. It's the richer farmers, curiously enough, in Haryana and Punjab that have been the loudest in complaining. I think we need to approach India needs to approach academic economists and other economic experts, because I think they would agree with the Wall Street Journal article 2 days ago. You need more of that sort of thing, and the community can have some impact. That's one area where it really can. And contact Indian American academics. There's one at my school, one of the best, Praveen Krishna, who has views on this. And there are others as well, I'm sure you all know. Get them to write on this subject.
Right, thank you. I wanted to thank all three panelists, Professor Nanda ji, Professor Walter Andersen, and Captain Alok Bansal ji. It was incredibly informative. This is a topic that's very dear to all of our hearts. As all of you mentioned, India and the US are natural allies. And as Nanda ji mentioned, that shared values alone are not enough to create a strong relationship. There have to be a development of the interests, and because of the growing threats caused by Chinese aggression and because of Pakistan, I think that under Trump and now under Biden, I think that it makes sense for those relationships to grow even stronger and more synergy between the various departments. So thank you all very much for attending. Thank you all for speaking, and thank you for your questions.